before I kind of dive into my talk, guys, I want to have you write some stuff down. This is a lot of stuff that I've never talked about before. Obviously, the theme of the talk is taking ownership, but I think to really understand why taking ownership is important, first you have to understand what happens when you don't take ownership. And I want you to start by writing down, and this is something that doesn't have to be part of the business. It could be part of your personal life. It could be anything. But I want you to try really hard to do it in an honest way and don't look at each other's papers and just do this for yourself. And just be really honest with yourself. Just start by writing down something that happened recently that was negative or something that didn't work out, that wasn't your fault or was as little your fault as possible, that you believe truly that you had as little to do with as possible, that it was something that you couldn't have otherwise prevented. I don't mean like it rained yesterday or like there's a war in Syria. I mean like something actually in your life, that happened to you or happened around you. And work hard here. Just think deep and try to think of something that you're pretty certain wasn't your fault, you didn't have to do with.
It could be a couple weeks, a month.
It could be a year ago. It could be 10 years ago. Recently is a relative term, right? So I just mean something that is relatively, that you think has had an impact on your life that wasn't a positive one, that you think you weren't responsible for it happening. And it's a hard thing to do, right? It's hard to be honest with yourself about something like that because you know you're supposed to take responsibility, but like also we don't in the moment, right? We tend to, everyone has that point, as John said actually in his talk, where we blame other people or, we make excuses basically. We make excuses and we blame other people. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to do that. But I want you to make sure that you have something and something significant written down. So this talk's going to be about a couple of different things. First, though, I want to talk about brain connectivity in general, which is a weird thing to start off with here. So human beings, all of us have brains that have relatively the same ability to the same ability to connect different neurons in our brains. It's like basically we all have the same exact mental ability to start with. Our brains are a series of neurons that are connecting or reconnecting. And these things form memories and they form habits, and those habits enable us to solve problems and make decisions, basically. And all of our brains work that way. And for any human being at any given age, your neurons have the ability to reconnect or connect to each other at about the same rate. That changes with age, but for another person that's the same age as Ryan, their brain has pretty much the exact same ability there. The process of neurons connecting and reconnecting is called neural connection. The opposite, something that your brain does when they're not connecting and reconnecting in different regions of your brain, is something called neural pruning. So if you don't use a part of your brain, or if you don't develop part of who you are, your brain actually starts to shut down those neurons and stop devoting power to them. It really is just a machine. It's an evolved machine. Before people like Aristotle discovered like a bunch of shapes, like the isodecahedron. Before he ever did, there were viruses that had already made the isodecahedron. So stuff that we're coming up with that's mechanical as a species, really, we've already evolved most of those things. So you really are just like a really advanced machine, and that's how you should think of yourself. Now, I think it's an important thing to consider when you're trying to think about what separates you from other human beings as far as ability goes, intellectual ability, learning ability. What is different about you, and how has your history shaped your brain? So imagine for a second that, like, this isn't a debate about nurture versus nature. Imagine for a second that you were born not deformed in some way, but your brain had the same capacity to grow and to become whatever someone else's did as well. And that seems to be more or less true throughout the world. But that leaves you with this question, like, if we all have the same intellectual ability, why am I better at this? Or why are they better at that? And I think that really the answer is a lot of our history helps us develop different mental constructs and different ways of thinking. So I've been experimenting a lot with this recently, not through like drugs or anything, but like just thinking about things differently. And thinking about the way that I'm thinking about things differently. And you may have heard, or maybe you've heard me speak about, I'm not sure if I mentioned this at a staff meeting, but trying to live emotionally 6 months from now. instead of living in the present, and almost treating my physical existence like a separate thing from my conscious existence, and having my consciousness control my physical present, but living in my mental future. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a different way about thinking what you're doing every day, thinking about what to do every day. It's like, imagine if it were a video game and your job was to succeed at the absolute highest level, and you were given this character. What would you do with that character in order to win the game, right? So that's like a different mental construct for thinking about who you are, or something that people have used in the past for memory, for example. If you struggle with memory, is trying to imagine actual physical constructs in your mind, like, say, imagine the house that you grew up in, and then when you want to remember something, put it in different physical locations in the house, and then when you want to recall it, just go and retrieve it. So these are like different mental constructs that are used to reorganize your brain, basically retrain your brain so that you can form different neural connections, so that you can think differently about things. But this isn't going to be like a highbrow talk about neuroconnectivity and stuff like that, or like a debate about nurture versus nature. But what I want to do is I want to share the very serious physical consequences in your brain that happen when you don't take responsibility for things, or rather, what I imagine those physical consequences to be when I think about the importance of like taking ownership, taking responsibility, and how when you are taking a ridiculous amount of ownership and responsibility, that really helps you unleash a greater level of personal power. And by power, I mean like actual intelligence, actual power, and ability to solve problems. So I guess my goal here is to, through this way of thinking, is to go from that world of excuses and blaming to the world of absolute responsibility for everything. So this is something that I actually share with my reps, is that your brain is like this giant problem-solving machine, and every time you say to yourself, I can't blank because blank, or I got this result because blank, and that blank is filled in by something other than yourself, what you're actually doing is you're taking your brain's ability to problem solve away. It's like switching the switch from on to off, because you're telling your brain that it's an impossible problem to solve and that it should no longer try to solve it. So it just stops. And essentially what you're doing is you're forcing your brain into a physical state of neural pruning, where it's no longer trying to make and remake connections. If you've ever watched, a cool video to look up would be if you look up the video of an artificial intelligence program trying to figure out how to play Super Mario. It's so freaking cool, because it is a graphical representation of the computer forming different neural networks. And you see it starts trying random things, and it wants to accomplish two things: move further on down the map and not die. And you can see when something goes wrong, it just tries another combination of things. And over the course of a couple of days, it figures out how to play the game perfectly. But when you tell yourself the game is impossible, you stop forming new neural networks and you stop trying to solve those problems. And this has a lot to do, and I'm sure you're starting to realize that that has a lot to do with taking responsibility. And it might be the difference between people who experience a very high level of intelligence later on in their life, and whatever that might be, and those who don't. So from running vector offices, you might encounter this. I've encountered people that can't add, not because of a mental defect. It's because at some point in their life they told themselves that I just can't do it, and whatever environment they were in, they were like, cool, guess you can't do it. Whereas in any normal environment, when you're in kindergarten or first grade and you say, I can't add, the teacher goes, of course you can add. Just keep doing it. And your brain's like, oh, okay. It keeps going, right? So this is part of the reason why, and I mentioned I'm not using drugs, but many people do. Watson and Crick, to discover the formation of DNA, were taking acid. They were taking acid because they knew that they needed to think differently about the problem, and they were struggling to, because they're scientists and they're very systematic. So they were dosing themselves with acid to try to rearrange their neural networks in a different way that would allow them to think differently about it. Eric Weinstein, who is a managing director at Thiel Capital, which is a massive and very prominent right now investment bank run by Peter Thiel, is a huge proponent of psychedelics and what they can do for your brain as far as rearranging things. Because these are people that try to think differently about everything. And when they can't solve a problem, their immediate assumption is that, wait, I can solve it. I need to give my brain an edge. I need to think differently about the problem. So when you're thinking about the advancement of your own intellectual ability, you should realize that there is no such thing as stagnant. You're either improving or you're going downward. Like, that's what neural pruning is. Neural pruning is your brain taking the neural connections that it's no longer using and eliminating them and getting rid of them. You have a finite amount of brain cells, right? So it's going to recommit resources to other things. Your brain is not all of a sudden going to start consuming more energy, more wattage basically. It's going to consume the same amount. So when you stop using certain parts of your brain, it recommits those resources to other things. You're actually destroying connections that you could have formed. So, and in general, when we talk about learning, I thought this is such a cool example. This isn't me. This is Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins, if you buy Awaken the Giant Within or read the book or listen to the audio, I think the audios are better than the book because it's like his actual talks. And it's just way more fun. It's more fun. He talks about how all great teachers, Buddha, Muhammad, Confucius, they use metaphors to convey the meaning of what they're talking about to the common man. Regardless of religious beliefs, most people would consider Jesus Christ to be a great teacher because his message has endured for millennia and it's grown like enormously throughout the world, right? So he's a great teacher. And think about what he said to spread Christianity. He didn't say to his disciples who were fishermen, go out and find me Christians. He said, I want you to be fishers of men. And I think that that's an important thing to realize about how you learn, is that, think about this. When you've struggled to teach something to someone, it's not because they couldn't learn it. It's because you couldn't connect what you knew with something that they already knew, which physically manifests itself inside of their brain. You see, what they already know exists as connections between neurons, and what you want them to know will also exist as connections between what is already formed. There's a physical manifestation of this. And your brain learns by association with what you've already figured out. It's like you don't learn calculus when you're a kindergartner, you learn addition. And then you add on multiplication and subtraction. And eventually you get to geometry and algebra, and only after understanding those things could you possibly ever even conceive of calculus. So it's association that happens throughout your entire life. And what I'm suggesting is that when you don't take responsibility for things, not only do you lose your ability to solve that problem from having failed at solving it, but you also lose your ability to solve all other more advanced problems that are related to that initial problem, which is the real scary part.
Say that again, George.
When you refuse to take responsibility for something, not only do you lose your ability to solve that, to learn how to solve that problem from having failed at solving it, but you also eliminate your ability to ever solve problems that are more advanced than that problem, but related to it.
In relation to it.
Okay?
One more time.
Okay, so when you refuse to take responsibility for something, not only do you lose your ability to learn from that failure about how to solve that same problem in the future, but you also eliminate any possibility of being able to solve problems that are related to that problem, but more advanced than it. It's the same reason why there aren't savants out there that cannot add but can do calculus. That would be impossible. Adding is a prerequisite for being able to do calculus because calculus involves addition, right? To be able to do those things. And these are things that take place in your business. They take place in your personal life every time you refuse to take responsibility for something. And we all do it for various reasons, by the way. For me, I tend to blame environment or outside reasons because of what most people would call arrogance and just overconfidence in myself, right? So couldn't possibly be my fault, right? It must be something else that has prevented me from succeeding here. And I know that's the wrong thing to do, and we all do it. For some people do it because of a lack of confidence for the opposite reason. We don't take responsibility, but it is universal amongst all people. And I guess the idea here is that if you can find ways to say, you know what, I definitely had complete control over that. What could I have done 6 months ago, 3 months ago, a week ago to prevent that from ever having happened? 6 years ago, what could I have done differently? And finding everything that you could possibly have been responsible for, and you are in some way responsible. If you get hit tomorrow in a head-on collision, you're responsible for living in the Philadelphia area. If you lived in Montana, you would not have encountered any cars. And maybe that's something that you need to think about is, where am I responsible? See, the real trouble is figuring out really what we must learn, or how we already think as well. And this is the second thing that I want you guys to write down is, and I'm going to tell my story first. There's the question that I ask myself is, why do I learn the way that I do? Or what separates me from others as far as my passion for continued learning and general intellectual curiosity, and even coming to understand any of the things about this business. And that is, it's a weird thing. So I think deeply and intensely about at what point in my life did these changes start to occur in me. And I think that that's an important thing to understand about yourself is, what is it that really causes you to learn? So for me personally, I draw back to this one memory every time. It's not like the fondest memories. In fact, it's kind of messed up. So when I was born, my parents moved back to their hometown, but they still continued to focus on their careers a lot. So I didn't really spend a lot of time with my parents. And in fact, my dad, he worked in international business development with Johnson & Johnson. There were times in my life where I didn't see him like 7-8 months out of the year. And I remember when I was young, I remember the road that we were on. I can't remember the car that we were in. But I remember asking my dad a bunch of like the typical like 5 to 8 year old like why questions. It's like, why is this way? Why is this way? Because he's the biggest source of information that I have, right? And I think that a lot of young people, like children, tend to do that. And I remember my dad getting pissed. We were on Maple Drive. I think we were headed north. We were like near the intersection of Maple Drive and Fireline Road in Palmerton, Pennsylvania. And I remember my dad getting pissed and telling me to not ask any more questions. And my reaction was, one, I would remember being upset. I remember how I felt. And I remember deciding, well, screw this guy. I'm going to figure out the answer for myself anyway. And I think that maybe that single thought there was the source of it all. Was the source of every deep learning and obsessive night spent reading things and looking things up and digging through things on the internet and trying to figure things out. And that is incredible. And I want you to think about that right now. I want you, in some way, in words, to try to describe how you learn and why you learn that way. Try to remember back now to a point in your life where you feel like maybe you established that system of learning. And it's a hard thing to do, again, but it's one of those questions that maybe if you can't answer it now, it's worth answering for yourself in the future. Not just how you learn, not just like, I learn visually, or I learn by doing. It's like, but why do you learn that way? At what point in your life that you can remember does that system originate from? Your learning process is the process that's going to help you rebuild your neural network. It's going to help you take responsibility of things. Realizing that anytime you get so frustrated that you need to blame others, that you need to shift responsibility, is probably your greatest opportunity to learn from that moment. We talk about how when you're uncomfortable, you're growing. But when you're upset and unable to take responsibility, you're not growing, but it's your biggest opportunity to grow. And it's one that maybe you haven't been seizing. Maybe I haven't been seizing in a lot of parts of my life as well. So the 2 bullet points on the agenda are launching 5 to 10 reps per week and creating 10K plus weeks. And that's the only time I'm going to mention those things. But the reality here is that when you're not... And we all do it when you're not doing those things, is that you need to find a way to take responsibility. And you need to find a way, if you're not going to do it, to learn everything that you can about how you could have done it. So your failures in the past can be this great source of learning, and you should think about how you want to think about problems and how you want to behave differently. Not just recognize your error, but dummy run it in your head. Experience it through acting it through in your head. When your brain has experiences, it can't tell the difference between imagined and real. And think about how you're going to react to things next time. Maybe even say them, right? Say them out loud. Practice them in a mirror. Think about what you're going to do differently and how you're going to behave, not just what you're going to do, but who you're going to be in the process of doing it. And imagine those things and physically reorganize your brain. This isn't like just thought, because I'm saying that your thoughts are physical things here, and that when you physically reorganize them in your brain and you continuously experience them over and over again, whether you experience it in reality or just inside of your brain, that you will reorganize your neural network and you will gain those abilities. Any ability that you want is at your disposal. And if your goal is to build a big team and to have those big sales weeks, then first build yourself, build your actual brain into the person that can do those things. And maybe this gives you the tools to be able to do that. Maybe you never take any of these things that I just said and never think about them again. But either way, you have that ability to rebuild and reconstruct and form connections between things that you never thought before. Think about things differently. Study things that have nothing to do with the business and relate them back to the business. And you will, because everything is connected, and you're just a series of connections as well.